Hello friends, welcome back to the channel. It's your host Street Urchin, the guy with the hair. Today we're going to be trying out a new segment that was suggested by my patron Afy the Lion, which I believe has the potential to bring in some at least clickbaity views. Hopefully it's working. So I kind of fancy myself as someone that spent way too much time learning about MBTI. I use it for social gatherings, job interviews, choosing friends, getting things for free, practical things. And I always hope that over the course of time that you as my viewers will have somewhat of the same functionality with it. You'll be more, responsible with it, but I believe that with my firm grasp on practical MBTI, trademark pending, I agree that it's time to put my skills and knowledge to better use, and perhaps start typing criminals. I mean, it's kind of like character typing, right? Just with a lot more murder. We'll start with a more recently trending character on YouTube, the infamous Jeffrey Dahmer.
I had some anger.
As is standard practice when diagnosing your serial killers, you look for cognitive function preference. Was Jeffrey Dahmer extremely ambitious? Did he prefer thinking for long periods of time? Was he highly emotional? Did he more live in the moment? Those are the kinds of questions you have to ask before you just assume he was an ENTJ psychopath, although that wouldn't be terribly surprising. Matter of fact, the most surprising part would be that he got caught so early. There are many ENTJs out there at this moment doing all kinds of bad shit that no one is even suspecting them. And to those that do know, they're either dead or being paid very well to stay quiet. So let's see if there's anything we can glean from his childhood. Born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, May 21st, 1960, Jeffrey Dahmer was supposedly a very lively, happy toddler. Seemed perfectly normal, outside of a great deal of ear infections, which somehow led to a double hernia diagnosis, and an operation at the age of 4 or 6. I found conflicting reports on that one. But around that time, he became very infatuated with dead animals, enjoyed playing with the bones and then figuring out where those bones were located on actual living animals, which in defense of the poor boy, Google Images didn't exist yet. After moving for the third time in 2 years, he began his collections, retrieving insects and small animal bodies, and supposedly kept pieces of them in formaldehyde. Who the fuck is watching this child? Jeffrey would have been about maybe 8 years old at the time, playing with formaldehyde in the backyard with dead animals. Anyways, old Jeff appears to be showing a preference for sensing. He enjoyed the aesthetic of skeletons and a desire to preserve the memories, to be constantly reminded of what he enjoyed. To some of the more normal introverted sensors, it could be referred to as memorabilia. Some like to have pictures of family, some enjoy models and action figures. Jeff liked dead creatures. As someone with introverted sensing in the 4th position, I collect memes, which of course disappears when my computer dies. Around the age of 10, he asked his father at the dinner table about bleaching chicken bones, because that's normal. Reportedly, his father was mostly absent from the home, focusing on his career, so he might have jumped at the chance to properly teach his son how to bleach and preserve animal bones, instead of teaching him how to, act around other humans. By now, it was reported that Jeffrey had little to no desire to develop attachments to others, being very shy, possibly low self-esteem, which some believe was brought on by having frequently arguing parents, trauma of going through surgery at such a young age, or it could have been, incredibly neglectful parenting, the father pursuing his career, and the mother who was frequently bedridden. In any case, Jeffrey does not exhibit the usual signs of preferenced extroverted feeling, that being cooperativeness and sociability. But perhaps he gets better in high school. No. He was still viewed as a loner, although he did manage to play some competitive tennis and was in the school band for a short period of time, which good on him for at least trying to learn how to be sociable while not further looking like a weirdo. Jeffrey later began to perform pranks which included faking seizures and cerebral palsy.
Damn it, Jeff.
He liked to get smashed at school, hiding beer or hard liquor in his backpack, referring to it as his medicine. Yeah, that's what I tell people it is as well. I really hope he didn't take the beer with him, because, that's what I would want, in history class mid-July. A warm PBR and a teacher who keeps asking me if I remember the historical dates. I don't. Get off my ass. At the same time, I understand the need to keep the thoughts down. Hashtag not all alcoholics. When he made it to puberty, he discovered that he was sexually attracted to other men, which would have been difficult for anyone to deal with in the 70s, even more so if he had a strong preference for introverted sensing. But come on, John Travolta in the 70s? I'd hit that. He also would have been scared to death to tell anybody, which may have fueled any traces of anger or anxiety. This also included a strong desire to be domineering in his fantasies, and at some point it developed into fantasies about beating his partners unconscious, and having his way with their bodies. He even went so far as to hide in some bushes and wait for a regular jogger to come by, attempting to act out the scenario. I imagine he was drunk at the time. Thankfully, the jogger didn't come by that day. It's also noted that his grades were about average, and then went downhill by 1977, so roughly around his senior year. Booze will do that. So let's break down Jeff's high school hijinks. He enjoyed alcohol. I don't know where he got it, but it's reported that he used it as medicine to keep his fantasies under control. I'm personally familiar with introverted sensors keeping a routine of alcohol consumption, or other mind-numbing chemical use. But we won't use that as evidence for Mr. Dahmer on the grounds of it possibly being a coincidence. But I'd like to touch on those average to poor grades. As I've explained numerous times, introverted intuition is not magical fairy juice that causes someone to have psychic powers. It manifests as ambition, goal-oriented, detailed planning for oneself, and the drive to see it through. Jeffrey does not seem to exhibit those traits. Whether it was his average to poor grades, or his botched attempt at brutalizing a jogger. Take an ENTJ, for example. If they wanted to kill a specific someone, they'd plan out exactly how they want it done. Study the target, pick the location carefully, choose the right time of day, and of course, pick an appropriate murder weapon. This is assuming it doesn't interfere with their plans to become a future senator. Of course, we'll also circle back to his lack of extroverted feeling. Reading a room certainly wasn't his strong point. The over-the-top jokes would have only succeeded in ostracizing him further. They even named the concept after him, referring to it as pulling a Dahmer. That's gonna get used in this video. Nothing quite like knowing that in high school you weren't a joker, but in fact you were the joke. I know INTPs are synonymous with being socially awkward, but even they know that faking seizures isn't going to be particularly helpful. This is the behavior of someone who wanted some kind of attention, obviously wasn't getting it at home, and once he found it, he saw no reason to change it. For his high school days, I award points to both introverted sensing and introverted feeling. Alright, have we got a pretty good baseline to work with so far? Jeffrey seemed to have a strong preference for memory, and was beyond bad at social cohesion. So let's dive into the meat and potatoes of this misunderstood young man. 3 weeks after his graduation, Jeffrey found a hitchhiker, a one Stephen Hicks, a young man like himself. He invited Stephen to his home, which was made more spacious by the evacuation of his mother and younger brother David. Jeffrey found himself sexually attracted to this man, but unfortunately Stephen began talking about girls, which I imagine was a little disheartening. But Jeff brought him home and they had a few beers. After some hours of talking, his guest wanted to leave. Jeffrey slapped him with a 10-pound dumbbell. Yeah. Then strangled the unconscious body. Now, I have to imagine that if he planned this out, a weighty lump of metal wouldn't have been his first choice of murder weapon. So I gather this was more of a spur-of-the-moment decision, assumingly brought on by alcohol consumption. In which case, I give him a point towards introverted feeling and extroverted sensing for his reactions to the situation. After he stripped Stephen's body, he figured there was time to rub one out. He then dragged the corpse to the basement. He initially buried the corpse, but 2 weeks later had the realization that someone might, find it. He later dissected and disposed of the body. The fleshy bits with acid and a toilet. The bones with a sledgehammer and scattered the pieces all over the backyard. By today's standards, that's like a CSI walk in the park. Mr. Dahmer wouldn't kill again for nearly 10 years.
What's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges?
During that time, he attempted college, failing miserably. Some people will blame his alcoholism, and as someone who's been drinking steadily every day for the past 14 years, I can tell you there's only so much you can blame on the booze. The body acclimates to the dulled state, and the mind attempts to compensate. The obviousness is, Dahmer wasn't a particularly intelligent young man, and had virtually no interest in higher learning. If I were a person that values pattern recognition, and I am, I would assume his mind continued to plague him with memories of the night with Stephen Hicks, with his desires becoming more severe, which would explain his consistent and abusive relationship to alcohol. After dropping out of college, his father insisted he join the US Army, because being a hands-on parent is apparently against the chemist's code. Jeffrey obliged and was sent off to basic training, then received training as a medical specialist. He sure seemed to enjoy human biology, didn't he? As you can imagine, didn't end well. Though he did manage to make it to West Germany before being honorably discharged due to his, alcoholism. He asked for a plane ticket to Miami, where he worked at a deli for a long while, then called his father asking if he could return to Ohio to live with him and his wife. Obviously, at this stage, Dahmer had absolutely no idea what he wanted to do with his life, other than drink and possibly kill people, and only one of those things did he accomplish in nearly a decade. Seemingly, the one extroverted intuitive thought he might have had would have been to go, live in Miami for a little while, instead of going back to what he was most familiar with. And that's assuming no one gave him the idea, but we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. By this age, age, he may have at least figured it was, worth a shot. 1 point for extroverted intuition. Jeff's drinking strikes again, and after a 10-day jail sentence of drunken disorderly conduct, Daddy once again made his son someone else's problem, and shipped him right off to his grandmother, which supposedly was working out for a while. He was doing chores, he was going to church, and was regularly going out to look for work. He did find a job as a phlebotomist, but was laid off 10 months later. Coincidentally, just after he was arrested for exposing himself at the State Fair Park. He sure knows how to pull a Dahmer. He, of course, spent the next 2 years unemployed, and apparently nothing interesting happened, even though his grandmother continued to give him spending money. So I guess he spent the next 2 years being drunk and fighting the urge to see what his neighbor's insides looked like. But he was eventually hired on at the chocolate factory. I wonder if Willy Wonka could have designed an everlasting gobstopper that, prevented you from having homicidal thoughts. Lazy ass. At this point, it looked like Dahmer was just gonna live out the rest of his days trying to live a normal life. But plot twist, he was propositioned for sexual activity at the local library. Guy just can't catch a break. He turned it down, but the thought got him all hot and bothered again. He finally decided to sack up and go visit the gay bars and bathhouses. He also stole a mannequin and attempted to use it for sexual release. And if you've ever used a fleshlight, you'll know that it becomes less of a pleasurable activity and more of a chore. Much like a mannequin, they don't clean themselves. Around this time, Dahmer was finally getting sexually active at the bathhouses, which of course he found relaxing. But he was irritated that his partners were moving around too much. For me, it's usually the opposite problem. I'm funny. And instead of simply informing his partners as to what he liked, or finding one that would be willing to be paid for such a service, he did the only real logical thing that would come to mind. He put sleeping pills in their drinks, which obviously got him banned from the bathhouses. Idiot. He continued this method of intercourse at hotels, which is where he should have brought the people in the first place. He gave up low-stress hunting grounds because he couldn't keep his feelings under control. 10 points from Murder Puff. Later on, he tried to dig up a fresh corpse, which would have made sense for him given his fascination with dead things and his desire to have sex with an unmoving body. But for him to think of that earlier in life, he would have needed to be a bit more experienced in out-of-the-box thinking. And he gave up on that because I guess the dirt was just a little too hard to dig up. Really seeing the introverted intuition there. He had another idea leak from his brain on September 8th, deciding to pleasure himself in front of two 12-year-old boys, and he was arrested. How has he not been locked up in some insane asylum at this point? The man displayed very little in the ways of forward thinking. His brain has to be mush from the years of severe alcohol abuse. He had difficulty seeing even the simplest of consequences for his actions. Does not have a strong preference for introverted thinking, and does not have a strong preference for either intuitive function. Strangely enough, in November of 1987, Jeff had become acquainted with yet another Stephen, where he returned with him to the Ambassador Hotel in Milwaukee. I'm sure it was just a coincidence. The next morning, he woke up with Stephen beaten to death, and having zero recollection of what happened. Although I'm fairly certain he had an idea, he managed to stuff Stephen's body into a very large suitcase for transportation. Now, I don't know how he got rid of any bloodstains on the sheets or the carpet. No one questioned him about strange noises. No one asked where the other man disappeared to. I guess everyone was just okay with Dahmer wheeling out a strangely lumpy suitcase that he didn't check in with. God damn. He took the body to his grandmother's house, where he filleted the corpse, splintered the bones, put the remains in garbage bags, and threw it in the trash. Okay, this seems like a massive plot hole, right? Not without further information. He risked throwing decomposing, smelly human remains in the trash. What if the trash can spilled over later? What if sweet old grandma took the trash out that afternoon? What if a wild animal got into it? The man knows how to dissolve flesh. He literally did it before. Was he strapped for cash or couldn't find the materials to make it? He didn't even attempt this until a week after he brought the corpse to his grandmother's house. He had time to think this through. He exhausts me. Unfortunately, this miracle of not getting caught persuaded Jeff to drop any restraint he had left, intending to kill many of his victims from this moment forward. Jeffrey continued on for nearly 2 more years, luring more young men with the promises of money at his brand new apartment. In almost every situation, he preferred the same tactics: sleeping pills and strangulation. However, his methods for disposal became way more streamlined, harkening back to his use of chemicals for cleanup and preservation. Which is great, because I was starting to think that character development was just a myth. He also seemed to enjoy the idea of leaving as much evidence around as humanly possible, going so far as to keep Polaroids around of his, processes, as well as severed human parts in the refrigerator. It seemingly didn't occur to him that the smells and loud noises would attract any attention to his tiny apartment in a high crime rate area, which I'd like to point out, even with numerous complaints, I guess the manager never bothered entering the apartment to check things out, nor did anyone break in and just ransack his home. Maybe it was the smell. At this time, he did experiment with some of his victims, drilling a hole into their skull and injecting acid or boiling water directly to the brain. Why did he think that would work? In an attempt to create some sort of sex zombie, he even tried a little cannibalism so that he could feel that they were a part of him. He supposedly didn't develop much of a taste for the blood, which is fair. He could have tried making a Bloody Gary, although it wasn't particularly well thought out. We give him another point of extroverted intuition for trying something new in his routine. Eventually, the sheer incompetence finally caught up with him. He invited Tracy Edwards to his apartment with the promises of $100 and some presumably cheap beer, which seemed to have been an incredibly effective strategy for him these past couple of years. In fact, that'd probably still work on me now. Hashtag don't eat me, bro. Upon stepping foot into Jeffrey's apartment, Tracy noticed the smell of decomposing bodies and rotted fecal matter, as well as the gallons of boxed hydrochloric acid. Jeff told him it was for cleaning bricks. What bricks, Jeffrey? Which of course is horridly disturbing. Even in the 90s, everyone knew to clean up a little bit before inviting your murder victims home. This man was a monster. After a little conversation, Jeff attempted to slap, cuffs on him. He only succeeded in getting one handcuff on, and instead of Tracy immediately running for his life, he queried into what Mr. Dahmer was doing. What is happening in this story? Without explaining, Jeff told the man that he was going to take pictures of him in the bedroom, and I guess Tracy agreed to that as well. He followed Jeffrey to the bedroom, where he noticed nude posters, a 57-gallon drum, and The Exorcist playing on good old VHS. So hang on. Acid in the living room, a near unbearable scent of rotten flesh, getting handcuffed, The Exorcist playing in the background. It seems legit. Jeff finally reveals a knife to dissuade Tracy from leaving. At this point, I'm not certain that was even necessary if he was willing to put up with the rest of it. They talked a little more. Jeff mentioned something about wanting to eat Tracy's heart. Normal conversation. Jeff got a little distracted during the, backwards crab walk or something. Tracy punches him and makes a break for it. I don't even know what functions are responsible for you to lose focus on a movie that you've seen a million times while your victim is in stabbing range. Mr. Edwards runs to the police, explains the situation. The police officers agree to check it out, if only to retrieve the appropriate key for the handcuffs. Thank goodness he stumbled upon Milwaukee's finest that night. Now I know what you might be thinking. Having a lucid escapee, with physical evidence still attached to his wrist, might give police officers a reason to come and question Mr. Dahmer, so he would have taken what little time he had left to start hiding evidence. Maybe hide the body parts in the space between the walls, or maybe the oven. Stash the crime scene photos in maybe his back pocket. Throw the knife out the window. Or maybe just come up with a lie and tell the cops that you've never met the man while denying entry into your domicile. But no to any of that. Jeffrey just couldn't resist the temptation to pull a Dahmer in front of the police. He instead admitted to handcuffing Mr. Edwards and went off to retrieve the handcuff key from his room. One officer stopped him immediately while the other went to look for the key. The officer noticed Jeffrey's knife sticking out from under the bed. Can you imagine? He glanced at an open drawer to see dozens of photos of Jeff's recent murder victims. And in the most surprising change of pace that I've ever read in any story, the officers actually arrested Jeffrey instead of writing everything off as some, elaborate Halloween prank in July. Afterwards, he just admitted to all his crimes in some very impressive detail, including dates, processes, names, even admitting to the ones the police had no evidence for.
Once it happened the first time, it just seemed like it had control of my life.
So that's the very short story of Jeffrey Dahmer's criminal career. Before we finish the diagnosis, I'd like to address some of the more common typings for Mr. Dahmer. Was he an ENFJ? Besides the fact that Jeffrey had the appeal and charisma of The Last Jedi, his goals for life were seemingly limited to get drunk, kill people. So introverted intuition wasn't exactly a strong preference here. Was he an ENTJ? Somehow this is more laughable? What ENTJ would settle for a garbage apartment, scatter evidence everywhere, and choosing to get wasted every night instead of heavily focusing on being a better killer? The answer being, there isn't one. If Jeffrey were an ENTJ, he'd have brought people to his estate, on schedule, and to make human stew with only the finest of ingredients, while implementing the most sophisticated tools at the time. His basement would have been as awe-inspiring as it would have been terrifying, with properly displayed bodies hanging from wires, and potentially several security cameras so he could, replay his escapades over and over. Most importantly, it's still quite likely he'd be on the loose, paying off or killing people that, had gotten involved. Lastly, we have the most common one, INTP. I assume that some people get the impression because Jeffrey used some, fancy science chemicals. In case you're wondering, it doesn't take a genius to pick up a book, believe what was read, then apply it to life. That, of course, would just be extroverted thinking. Jeffrey did not experiment much with chemistry. He simply used what was appropriate to clean and preserve his victims. He also proved himself to not be much of an introverted thinker, taking very little time to thoroughly plan out his activities. Jeffrey also wasn't exactly someone who liked to think outside the box. Although it was clear that there was some extroverted intuition use, it applied to basic changes, such as his trip to Florida, a couple different experiments on preserving body parts, the sex zombie. It didn't work. As for the introverted sensing part, oh boy, do we have a lot of that. His desire to keep the memories going were the focal point of this story. His recollection of past events was phenomenal. And of course, extroverted feeling. Even INTPs have an incredibly small desire to have friends, to be socially accepted somewhere, to get good at reading a room. Jeffrey just had zero interest in the subject. And I might go so far as to simply say he didn't have it as a function altogether. It just disappeared. In my not so humble deductions, Jeffrey Dahmer was simply an unsocialized, traumatized, extremely neglected ISTJ. Without parents around, he tried to fit himself into society, and failed. This is easily noticeable with the series of arrests, firings, alcohol abuse. Could he have been saved? Could he have been molded into a more functioning member of society? Obviously. Lead introverted sensing desires structure, systems to follow, adherence to traditions. With no one around that gave a rat's ass about him, he started his own traditions, which I imagine there were some others that also followed in those footsteps. But those are videos for another day. If enough people like this video, we'll do John Wayne Gacy next. Jeffrey Dahmer was an ISTJ, a very normal person, put through some very abnormal circumstances. So, how many normal people do you know?